Okay, good afternoon. So today I'm just going to finish our lecture on externalities. So we have already made some formal approach. We already did some formal approach of the model on externalities. And we saw that in this particular scenario, externalities do happen when markets do not yield the most optimal outcomes. Right now, again, that's one of the weakness of the standard economic model when we ignore the fact that some person's consumption or some firms' production have a negative or positive impact on other people or to the rest of the society. And that means that whatever outcome these transactions, whatever outcome these consumers attain or producers do, we're getting suboptimal effect, or we're generating either an adverse or a really positive effect to the rest of the society, and that's not taken into account by our usual microeconomic models. All right. And I mentioned last meeting that externalities are, well, that's the reality that the society is facing, and yet it seems that it is somehow ignored in economic theory, and we're just devoting just a portion of that, or we're just devoting a portion um, of our analysis on externalities. Although I would say that most studies now are already acknowledging the fact that, well, externalities do happen, and there should be a solution. There should be a way for us to resolve this. Na hindi lang dapat siya parang minor problem of the existing models, but rather this should be the centerpiece of our conceptual and policy analysis, because it does happen every time. All right, now in this pandemic, just the mere act of going out of the house to interact with other people, or siguro if you plan to do some leisure activity outside of your home, you're already producing some form of externality. Right, kahit pa sabihin natin na you are in your full protective gear, you're still creating some risk to the rest of the society. So that's the central argument with respect to market failures and externalities. Market failures happen because, well, the society's intention or the society's welfare doesn't match with private interest, and that's quite ironic because in our usual consumer and producer theory, we are made to assume that individuals are rational if they're pursuing their own private interest. You're completely ignoring the whatever outcome there is to the rest of the people around you, or to the rest of the society. So that's the thing about externality. So let's just review this for a bit, and then probably I'll give you a couple of examples, um just to give you a more formal approach in understanding externalities and how do we resolve it. All right, I think I've done this last week, but let's just have a review, and probably let's use that as a starting point in discussing public goods, which is also, you would say, a special form of externality. So we already know this, and the this optimization problem that you can see here is, again, this standard optimization problem. So we can see here from a consumer's perspective, we argue that the person maximizes his or her own utility, all right? And we assume, of course, that the person um, consumes xi, but he also have some choice over H, right? So this H is the spillover to the rest of the society. So what we didn't do last week is to see what really happens when this particular person tries to maximize his own utility without taking into account uh, the rest of the society. So the optimization problem that we have in slide 13 already internalizes that problem. That's the reason why we came up with the solution. Na the socially optimal condition in the presence of externality is when you choose H sub zero, that equates the marginal This is the marginal utility of the person producing the externality. And this is this utility that's being um, incurred by the second person who experiences the negative externality. Okay, or it could be in the form of a positive externality. Okay, of course depends on the value of H star. Now, if you are person one and if you're producing a negative externality, let's just do that in our whiteboard for the term. Okay. So if you are person one, so this is your utility. So it's gonna be U I X I H such that your constraint is gawin na lang nating linear. So it's gonna be P X I must be equal to some budget constraint. Let's denote that as W. So notice that if we compute for the first order condition, so that's gonna be L. This is the Lagrange, no? So constraint optimization requires a Lagrange method. Okay, so that's gonna be UI xi and h plus lambda. So what I'm showing here is that without any interventions, without any, say, government intervention, without any societal interventions that can curtail negative or positive externalities, this is what will happen. So if everyone pursues their own interest, ito yung mangyayari. Ito yung magiging solution. Ito yung magiging outcome. So this is your constraint. So that's gonna be W minus PXI. At the onset, you would notice that from person one, this is person one. Suppose this is the utility of person one. From person one's perspective, you would notice that at the onset, wala na siyang pakialam dun sa H. Alright? It's part of his objective function, right? It's U of I. Pero if you notice the constraint, H doesn't appear here. Alright? Which means that, in effect, this person can consume H without any cost at all. Alright? And if he were to pursue his personal, if he were to pursue his personal private interest in consuming H, and knowing that H can affect the rest of the society, he will do so up to the highest possible value of H. Kaya nagiging detrimental siya doon sa mga tao sa paligid niya. And mathematically, you would see that for xi, fine, this is still your usual result. So this is still going to be the partial of L with respect to the partial of, say, xi. It's going to be equal to, of course, this is the partial. It's going to be the partial of ui over the partial of xi. It's usual result, no? And it's going to be minus p lambda p, and that's going to be equal to 0. Fine, we know that already. For consumer goods, yan naman talaga yung usual result. But notice what happens here. Wala si H dito sa constraint. Therefore, in the FOC, notice that you would see that this person would just consume as much AH as possible. So that's partial of L or partial of H. Okay? And that's going to be the partial of UI with respect to the partial. Oops. This is going to be the partial H. And that's going to be equal to 0. All right. Now, if UI takes the form of the quasi-linear utility function, as you saw last week, okay, if it takes on the quasi-linear form, so let UI be equal to phi of, sige, let's just denote this as phi of H. All right. Let's treat X. Let's try to treat X as a numeraire. Okay, suppose ganyan yung function mo. So yung FOCs mo, ito yung magiging itsura. So it's gonna be, ano yung partial ng UI with respect to X? So that's just gonna be partial of L with respect to the partial of xi. Maganda lang magiging itsura niyan. That's just gonna be 1 minus lambda p. Okay? Equal to 0. For h, ito lang magiging function niya. Partial of L over the partial of h. That's just gonna be phi. Sige, to be specific, gawin natin phi 1. Kasi you're talking about consumer 1. So that's gonna be phi prime of h. Alright? Or sige, phi prime 1 of h. Okay. So ano ibig sabihin nito? Ibig sabihin nito, for this optimal solution, right? For this optimal solution, h star, okay? This means is that this person will consume as much h as possible until he reaches this. Okay, until he reaches this point where the marginal utility that he gets from consuming h reaches 0. Pero we know from our early optimization that if this person internalizes this externality, or well, if the society compels him to internalize this externality, the optimal, the socially optimal, or well, they would say the Pareto optimal outcome is actually, ano ba yung Pareto optimal outcome mo? The Pareto optimal outcome mo is the point where the marginal or selection of h such that the marginal utility of person 1 must be equal to the marginal disutility of person 2. Okay? So the fact na ginawa niyang 0 to, or he would choose h that such that this marginal utility will reach 0, it already tells us that, well, in the case of a negative externality, you're producing too much h, right? So in practical terms, if you can think about it, in practical terms, if you're this bad neighbor, for example, who keeps on playing loud music at, say, 3 in the morning, mataas yung utility mo kasi you would choose the level of noise h star that will maximize your utility at the expense of other people. Alright? So, sasagarin mo yung ingay. Sige lang, ingay ka lang kasi wala ka namang pakialam sa ibang tao eh. But you are ignoring the fact that you're affecting everyone else. So, in a socially or Pareto optimal outcome, you should select H0. That equates these two. All right. Now, in the slides that we talked about last week, it's just a matter of selecting, or it's just a matter of implementing certain policies or certain interventions that will compel the person to select H sub 0 instead of selecting H star. How would you compel that person to lessen the noise? Right? How would you compel that person to lessen the noise? How would you compel that person to, if you're a smoker, how would you compel the individual to lessen his smoking? And we already know certain policies, lalo na in terms of smoking, in terms of, I don't know, jaywalking, in terms of illegal parking, for example, or speeding, right? You can imagine all forms of negative externalities. The government has already implemented certain, at least for as far as policy is concerned, we know that the government has already implemented certain rules, no, certain laws that will minimize that negative externality. Okay. One, of course, is the Pigovian tax that we talked about. Another is, balikan natin si slide. Right. So we have seen that the socially optimal outcome in the presence of externality is if the marginal utilities and disutilities of person one and person two are equal, no? So impose this, well, probably I've repeated myself because yeah, I just came back to check something, no? But to achieve this, we have to compel the other person to ensure that his or her level of consumption matches the socially optimal outcome. Okay, so to encourage these people to attain this optimal outcome, we can implement, for example, Pigovian taxes. Right? Of course, the challenge here is how do you impose the optimal level of taxes? Probably one question that you can think of is: would you consider sin taxes as a form of Pigovian tax? Right? Is it does it hinder the person who produces the externality from over providing the bad, no, like the smoke, no, the second hand smoke. So of course we're working on the assumption that taxes are easily implemented and that these form of taxes, uh, these taxes do discourage the people from over providing or from over producing that negative externality, right? So we have seen this already, no, na, well, the optimal level of taxes is the tax level such that this T of H, this TH, should match this utility that the rest of the society is experiencing. So we already know this. And another solution, of course, is enforceable property rights. If you could imagine that people are trading, right, trading the rights to say the pads or the goods, right? Um, we can achieve the socially optimal outcome. Okay. So most of the results that we can see for the taxes and enforceable property rights already draws from our initial exercise. No? So if you optimize this social utility function, you could consider this as your social utility function. If you maximize this social utility function, okay, it's just a matter of identifying saan ngayon papasok yung taxes or saan ngayon papasok yung fees, right? In the case of the enforceable property rights, okay? So saan ngayon papasok? And such that these fees should be equal to the optimal condition or yung disutility that the person is experiencing, okay? So you can also do this for production externalities. I think this is where we stopped last time, no? So this becomes analogous in the case of production externality. This becomes analogous to our initial exercise. Okay, so let's consider this case. So imagine firm one. Okay, so suppose you have firm one. In this case, you have firm one who produces Y, right? Produces Y such that his cause or this person produces a byproduct H that is disposed post production. So in effect, uh, costless para sa kanya yung production ng H. Firm 2, on the other hand, produces Y2, but of course inadvertently incurs some of the cost from waste H. So you can imagine this as, fishermen experiencing polluted water, so nakakadagdag sa cost nila yan. Okay? So in this case, or simply put, this post production, this byproduct H affects both firms. All right, for one, or of course in a rather different way. For one, the first firm doesn't really experience any additional cost in producing H. Okay. Of course, later on, when we force this firm to take into consideration the pollution that this firm is creating, doon na siya magiging additional burden. to the firm. But for now, without any restrictions, without any intervention, this H affects both firms, right? Or technically si firm 2 mas naapektuhan. Okay? Now, if we are still operating under the assumption that we will always achieve the optimal, socially optimal outcome if all agents try to maximize their benefits. In this case, if these firms try to maximize their profits, the earlier assumption, the earlier hypothesis was you would always achieve the best social outcome. However, in the presence of externality, that's not the case. Hence the term market failure. So if the firm, right, let's consider firm 1. Right, let's consider firm 1. Okay, punta natin, lagay natin sa slide. Let's consider firm 1. It's in the context of consumption, but then again, you can still use this framework to understand how production externality works. So if this is firm 1's profit, so that's P1, kasi magkaibang market, let's treat them as different markets. C1, cost, firm 1, Y1. Pero meron silang common denominator, which is H. Kung si firm 1 yan, and if he just wants to maximize his profit without while ignoring the byproduct H, this is what he will do. He will just maximize this. So that's gonna be partial of I1 with respect to partial of Y1. Okay, so that's gonna be, of course, the margin, the price. Right? Price 1 must be equal, or is equal. Yeah, later on you would see that it must be equal to the marginal cost of producing Y1. Must be equal to 0. And later on, you know that in terms of profits, assuming, of course, that this firm ignores the externalities, our assumption earlier in our models that price must be equal to what? The marginal cost. Okay, partial Y1. But of course, we cannot ignore the fact na meron ka pa ring H dyan. Right? He is producing H. So you still have to take into account. You have to take that into consideration when you take when we compute the FOC. So this is gonna be the partial of pi 1 with respect to the partial of H. So that's gonna be negative. Eh, wala to eh. Wala kang H dito. Okay? Wala kang H dyan. So this is gonna be negative C, well, negative partial of C1 with respect to partial of H equals 0. Ano implication? You just multiply both sides by -1 and it turns out that this firm will just produce as much pollution as it wants. Alright? Or until it minimizes its marginal, until it minimizes its total cost. So that's gonna be C1 over partial of C1 over partial of H equals 0. Ano implication nito? Like in our earlier example on, say, noise, no, consumption, consumer externality or consumption externality. This firm 1, this firm will produce as much H as possible. It will produce so much H, right, until it minimizes his cost, right, or until the marginal cost of producing that byproduct H reaches 0. However, the problem here is that we are ignoring, or this firm is ignoring the fact that, well, siya, pinoproduce na itong H, but the fishery has no control over H. Right? That's what happens to firm 2. If firm 2, right, like what you saw in the slides, firm 2 will be facing this profit function. Right? Assume natin na si fishery yan. Or let's assume that this firm is a fishery. right? And of course, this is going to be the price. This is going to be the output minus the cost of uh, production, Y2H. Okay? He has no control over H. So he cannot, of course, this firm cannot use this they cannot use this as a choice variable like in the example in the slide. So if he has no choice over H, then this the first order condition will just be simply equal to the partial of I2 with respect to the partial of Y2. Okay, so like in our earlier models, no, this is going to be P2 minus the partial of C2 over the partial of Y2. And that must be equal to 0. So therefore, the fisheries optimal condition would be P2 equal to the partial of C2, which of course incidentally contains, just to emphasize the argument, incidentally contains Y2 and H. Okay. Y2 H partial of Y2. Ano yung sabihin nito? It means that firm 1 will be producing as much H as possible without him considering that that level of pollution, H, or that level of negative externality will be spilling over towards the cost of firm 2 or the fishery. Okay? So, si firm 2, he has no choice. He would just have to choose Y2 that will maximize his profits. But of course, this will have a bearing on his total cost. If waters are polluted, ano mangyayari sa production niya? It will affect his production. He was not doing anything, but somebody else is, right? And that has a bearing on his total cost, right? And that could have an effect on his total production. Okay, so that's the form of production externalities that we're witnessing here. You have a firm that produces, say, a pollutant, right, affecting everyone else, right? Affecting everyone else, like another firm, for example. Have another firm affecting their production process, adds up to their total cost. All right. So that's your negative externality in the case of production. Okay. Now, how do you solve this? Right. In our slides, let's share it again. In our slides, we saw that to resolve this, you can still implement the same rules. No, you can still implement the same rules. You can still implement, say, Pigovian taxes in the presence of production externality. Okay. And of course, before we go through those solutions, um, to to find out the socially acceptable outcome, we can just allow these firms to we can allow firm one to internalize the negative externality, right? And when firm 1 internalizes that negative externality, meaning may cost na yung H, right? If it takes into account the cost of the second firm, okay? If he takes into account the fact that, well, he is affecting the profits of firm 2, or you can think of it this way. Think of firm 1 as a factory and the firm 2 as fishermen, and assume that they are now operating in the same enterprise. Now, if they're now operating in the same enterprise, this will just be the sum. Let me correct this. This is going to be the sum of the revenues from the two outputs, and this is going to be the sum of the cost. And if that happens, right? If the firm, share with it, let me demonstrate that. Okay. To resolve this problem and to find out the socially optimal outcome, what if we allow these firms to what if we allow firm 1 to internalize the negative externality? That is, what if we allow firm 1 and firm 2 to merge, right? So if we merge these two firms, the profit function will now look like this. So let's denote this the total pie. So when we internalize Internalizing the production externality. So if you internalize the production externality, that's going to be equal to P1 Y1 plus P2 Y2 minus the cost of firm 1 Y1H minus the cost of firm 2 Y2H. So now, since they're now operating in the same enterprise, we can now choose Y1, Y2, Y1, Y2, and H. So optimal Y1, Y2, and H. And we can see the socially optimal condition. So for profits, this is going to be the case, right? So pi, the partial of pi with respect to the partial of Y1 is going to be equal to P1, the usual conditions. So this is still going to be the partial of C1 with respect to the partial of Y1. That's going to be equal to 0. Copy this. Ganun din kasi mangyayari dun sa output 2. Okay? Ang magiging difference niya would be the treatment of the externality. So this is going to be Y2, this is going to be P2, this is going to be C2, this is going to be C2. Now, if you maximize, if you optimize this profit function this time with respect to H, so the partial of pi with respect to the partial of H, that's going to be equal to negative C1, okay, negative partial, sige, to be specific, that's going to be the partial of C1 with respect to the partial of H minus the partial of C2 with respect to the partial. Palitan natin itong isa. Partial of equals 0. Now, if I move C2 on the right-hand side and will change the signs, this will yield the similar condition that we had earlier. No? So this is going to be partial of C1 with respect to the partial of H must be equal to the negative of the partial of C2 with respect to the partial of H. Okay? Which is, again, of course, this is going to move. This is analogous to our earlier condition. Ano pa sabi natin kanina? The choice of H should be chosen such that the marginal utility of the first consumer 1, must be equal to the negative disutility of consumer 2. Di ba pareho lang? It's analogous, right? This is the marginal cost. In the case of production externalities, and of course, depending on the model, the idea is still the same, right? Whatever you produce as a cost or whatever optimization that you do, you have to take into consideration the disutility or the additional cost that you are imposing on the other, the additional cost that you're imposing on the other person or the other firm or the rest of the society. And you can mix this up. You can also think about a model. You can also consider a model that combines both production and consumers or both firms and households, and the outcome, the premise would still be the same. All right, that is your utility, or when you select the level of externality, that if you want to select the level of bad that you want to consume, right, it must be equal. The socially accepted, the socially optimal outcome would be the case where the utility, in the case of the utility, the marginal utility or the marginal cost, right, that you are incurring must be equal to the negative must be equal to the disutility or to the additional cost that you are incurring on the other firm. Right? So that's the socially optimal outcome. Without this setup or without any intervention, this will just be equal to zero. Parang yung nakita natin dito. Just equal to zero. And in the case of the consumer, zero lang din yan. He will over-provide. He will over-provide the bads. In the case of the production external, negative production externality, the firm will produce so much pollution, right, given this condition. Okay. Now, how do you impose this socially optimal outcome to the firm? That's one option. For production externalities, you can number one, you can force the firm to merge, right? You can force the firm to merge the production process, like what you have seen earlier, like what we have seen here. You can merge the production process. Of course, that's gonna depend. That's gonna depend on the production process. That's gonna depend on the operations of the firm. That's gonna depend on the owners of the firm. If two industries are not similar to each other, then of course, it may not be feasible. Okay. You can also implement Pigovian taxes. So just to ensure that H is optimal. Okay. So again, one of the questions that you have here is, as an exercise, how can you implement Pigovian taxes to ensure that H is optimal? Of course, you can argue that the Pigovian taxes must be at least equal to this. Kung ano man yung cost na na-incur ni fisherman, right? Kung ano man yung cost na na-incur ni fisherman, this cost may appear in the form of tax, right? Tax dito sa cost, ha. Additive siya. Hindi siya production tax, kasi the production tax will just go here. So it's just going to be an additional, or actually lower, it diminishes the price per unit of output. Why? Yung Pigovian tax na to would be in the form of an additional cost to the firm. Okay? So take note of the difference, right? Production tax goes here. It lowers, a production tax lowers the unit price of your output. But if you're talking about reducing the negative externality, right? Or well, if you want to reduce a positive externality, you can impose subsidy, right? A Pigovian tax will add up to the firm's cost, right? So kung in the case of the fisher, in the case of the firm that produces the pollution H, if he were to attain this level of optimal level of H, the cost or the Pigovian tax should be equal. The Pigovian tax should be equal to this, right? Negative C2 prime. And papasok siya ngayon dito sa objective function ni firm. In any case, let me just show it. Okay. For the Pigovian tax, if you were to implement, if the government were to implement a Pigovian tax, firm 1 will face this profit function. Pigovian tax for the firm. Pigovian tax for the firm will be equal to pi 1 equal to P1 Y1. O notice that hindi siya papasok dito sa price kasi hindi naman siya production tax eh. If it were a production tax, it will come in here and it will not help. Right? It will not help resolve the negative externality. In order for it to be an effective tax that will reduce the negative externality, it should come as a cost. So C1 Y1 H minus T H of H. Okay. So additive cost siya dito. Where, like in the case of the consumer consumption externality, TH must be equal, TH must be equal to negative C2. Negative partial of C2 over partial of H. Okay. So if this tax perfectly captures the value of the additional cost to the fisherman, the the optimal choice of firm one with respect to H would be partial of pi, partial of the profit of firm one with respect to partial of H would be equal to the okay, well, that's to be specific. It has to be positive. Na? Right. So it's gonna be negative. Sorry, that's negative C1 um, H. Sorry, partial of C1 with respect to partial of H minus T minus T H equal to 0. Oh, sorry, yeah, it should be, yeah, it should still be negative. Oh yeah, it's positive. It should be positive. Kasi ililipat mo siya. Okay, lipat mo siya dito. Okay. So if you move it on the right-hand side, that's gonna be partial. Copy ko na lang to. It's gonna be partial C1 respect to H equals TH. So that TH must be equal to, well, negative, sorry. No, negative TH. Right. So that TH must be equal to partial of C2 with respect to H2 or yung marginal cost yung additional marginal cost ni firm 2 to establish the socially optimal outcome. Right? Na sabi nga natin, analogous dun sa consumption condition, dun sa consumption, socially optimal outcome natin in the case of consumption. Okay? So that's the case of externality. Now, I gave or already posted a problem set that you can use as an exercise. No? You can consider that as an exercise. Or we can just answer this last question and we move on to public goods. So let's answer this. Sorry, hindi ba naka-share? Yeah, hindi pa naka-share. Okay. So let's try to answer. Okay. Okay, there you go. Let's try to answer this question. Suppose you have a firm that produces output with a differentiable and strictly convex cost function C of y and h, where y is an output and whose price is p greater than 0 and h is a negative externality. And this is an example, again, this is an example of combining the case of production and consumption externality. So suppose that externality affects a single consumer whose derived utility is given by phi of h plus m. And the question is, we derive the first order condition for the firm's choice of y and h. Okay? And let's derive the first order condition for in this case, the socially optimal h, the part 2. And then the next question is, can the government use quantity tax, right? So yung kanina, sabi natin, production, alam na natin yung sagot sa number 3. You cannot use quantity tax to ensure optimal allocation kasi quantity tax affects the price of Y, not the cost of H when he produces the negative externality. So you cannot use quantity tax. You can show that, right? You can show that. So you can just let P change, you can just change P, right? Say reduce that by some quantity tax T. So that's the unit price will just be equal to P minus T. And it won't change anything about the negative externality that the consumer is facing. Okay, so let's answer that. Okay, so let me just share the screen again. Okay, so you have a firm. Sabi dun sa problem, you have a firm with a differentiable and strictly convex cost function. So the profit function of the firm is given by pi equals py minus cy and h. Oops, y h. Okay, and the utility, the utility of the consumer without it with the numerator good m. So yung utility function niya would be u of h. So this is gonna be u m h. So this is gonna be phi of h plus m. Okay. So the first question is, what will be the first order condition for the firm? Now, without internalizing that negative externality h, or that externality h that the firm is producing, ang magiging first order condition niya would be something similar to this. It's gonna be similar to this. So the first order condition, FOC for the firm will be equal to partial pi with respect to partial of y. So this is gonna be p minus c prime of y h. And of course, that's equal to 0, and therefore you will just set price equal to the marginal cost of producing y. How about h? Since siya yung nagpo-produce ng externality na h, he will just maximize the use. He will just produce as much h until the marginal cost becomes 0. So the partial of pi with respect to h this time would be equal to negative c prime. Not to be specific, this is c prime of y. This is c prime of y. This is c prime. This is c prime of y. This is c prime of h. Okay, until it's equal to 0. YH until it's equal to 0, and therefore he will produce as much h as he wants, right? Until the marginal cost reaches 0. Okay. So this is gonna be the first order condition of the firm. This answers question 1. There will be an over provision of h. Kasi nga wala siyang pakialam dun sa nangyayari sa consumer. Now, if he were to be compelled to introduce or to consider what's happening to the consumer, then it's gonna be an additional cost, right? More or less, it's gonna be an additional cost for the firm. So, internalizing externality, what's gonna happen? All right. So the profit function now becomes pi equals py minus, ito na magiging total cost niya. So c y h plus yung consumption na ginawa niya plus m. Bakit natin siya nilalagay dito sa cost side ni firm? Kasi nga, if you were to internalize this, magiging additional burden sa firm yun eh. Alright? He has to take into account na nakaperwisyo siya. So of course, kailangan niya i-compensate yung consumer na naperwisyo niya because of H. So if you were to internalize that, the new FOC will become, or the choice of H will then become, wag na natin isama yung Y kasi alam naman na natin yan eh. FOC with respect to H, or that will yield the optimal H, the FOC would be pi, partial of pi, partial of pi with respect to the partial of h. So that's gonna be negative c prime of h y h plus or minus, no, minus phi prime of h. That's gonna be equal to 0. And this becomes equal. It's analogous to your socially Pareto optimal outcome that we have already seen earlier. So rearranging terms, this is going to be equal to c prime of h yh, and it's going to be equal to the negative of phi prime of h. So ano yung story? The story here is that the firm should choose H. He will have to choose H. Unlike in the earlier condition, he will have to choose H such that the marginal cost of producing H, marginal cost of producing H must be equal to the marginal disutility that the person is incurring when he inadvertently consumes the pollution or the negative externality H. In other words, kung ano man yung marginal cost na to should be used to compensate the person, right? In the previous case na walang internalization of that externality, wala siyang kinocompensate kasi nga, well, he will just produce H until this becomes 0. But now, in any case, as anong nangyari is as the firm produces H, right? That marginal cost should go to, or it should be at least as high as the disutility that the consumer is facing. And in any case, you can consider this as a compensation, right? Yung nadadagdag na cost dun sa firm, that would be in the form of compensation to the affected consumer, right? And that compensation must be equal to the negative externality, or sorry, to the negative disutility that consumer one is facing or receiving. Okay, so yeah, that basically concludes the discussion on externalities. Now let's move on to public goods. Right. So public goods are goods that are neither rival nor excludable. So more or less, this is a special case of externalities kasi um, you have a single good that basically affects everyone else. Right. Now, consumption of a unit of this good does not preclude other consumers from consuming the good. One example would be, classic textbook example is a lighthouse, national defense, common TV in the living room area, Wi-Fi connection na walang password, right? Of course, you could argue that it's excludable, right? You already know this. The concept of public goods, you already know this in your introductory economics, no? If a good cannot be depleted, right? And you cannot exclude other people from consuming it, that's a public good. One typical example of a public good would be yun nga, yung TV sa bus, no? Can you consider that as a public good? More or less, no? Kasi you cannot really exclude other people. Or well, in a technical sense, that could be excludable kasi you can exclude other people who are not riding the bus na manood dun sa TV, sa TV na nasa bus. But in any case, lahat kayo dun sa loob ng bus, you can treat that TV, whatever information that TV is spewing out, that's a public good. So why are we studying public goods in the context of microeconomics? Because the provision of a public good depends on the individual's valuation, right? And there are cases that public goods are not provided, and that's actually the reason why the government comes in. Public goods are not provided because no individual will be willing to produce or to purchase the public good. Right? If a good cannot be excluded, if you cannot exclude other people from consuming the good, and if it is non-rival, okay, there's no incentive for the individual to contribute. Right? Group projects, would you also consider group projects as a public good? To some extent, yes. Kasi, well, yung output na yan, well, it affects everyone, pero one can always free ride. Right? And that's the problem with public goods. Individuals can always free ride. Okay? Now, if everyone thinks that they can free ride, then the public good will not be produced. In a similar case would be yun nga, group projects. No? I'm not sure if you can consider that as a public good, but in a strictest sense, yeah, yung benefit, if if the grading of a group project is across the board, then more or less it's non-rival and non-excludable. Okay? Kasi isa lang yung grade na makukuha niya for the project. So at least one person will always free ride. And if one person free rides, then everyone else free rides, then yeah, it's gonna be problematic. It's not gonna be, no effort will be given out. All right. Now, ideally, a public good is provided if the total benefit from the provision is greater than the cost of providing the good. So, dito na nagkakaproblema. We know that public goods benefit everyone. Okay. But of course, there's a cost of providing the public good. And if people undervalue their reservation price, right? Feeling nila, ay, hindi naman ako makikinabang dyan, they won't contribute as much. Right? And if they don't contribute as much, if they don't contribute the necessary amount of resources or the necessary amount of money to pay for the cost, sorry, pay for the cost of the public good, that's going to be the case of free riding. You have a case of free riding. And they could still get, the problem with free riding is they will freeload. May kinabang sila dun sa public good kahit sabi nila hindi naman ako masyadong may kinabang dyan. Pero hindi siya nag-contribute dun sa cost of provision. That's going to be a case of free riding. And if everyone does that, the public good will not be provided. That's the reason why governments normally come in to provide public goods, right? And again, it's a clear case of market. You could consider this as a case of market failure. Kasi nga, you're expecting that, excuse me, you're expecting that private markets are supposed to provide all kinds of goods, but there are certain goods. That, well, because of these valuations, right? Because of this undervaluing of reservation prices and all, they may not be provided by the market. Right? So let's have a formal discussion of public goods. So suppose you have a set of individuals I with a utility function that is non-rival, or with a utility function whose that's determined by a non-rival and non-excludable good y. Suppose halimbawa as internet to. Halimbawa nasa isang bahay kayo. Magandang example to. Suppose nasa isang bahay kayo and hindi naman nauso yung TV ngayon. Textbook examples would consider TV as a public good. Yung TV sa isang bahay. So let's consider this Y as let's consider Y as an internet modem. Globe, Converge, Smart, whatever you want. No, so utility function phi of Y would be the utility that individual I gets from that public resource, which is the internet. Now, suppose that the provision of Y entails a cost C of Y. Sabihin natin, yung monthly service fee mo plus yung installation fee mo, that's C of Y. Now, the Pareto optimal allocation of the public good Y should solve the following maximization problem. Right? Typical, marginal benefit must be equal to the marginal cost. Assume natin na si Y is differentiable, pero of course, we're talking about Wi-Fi here. So it's just a matter of providing or not providing. So the marginal benefit from providing the internet, ang ibig sabihin ng equation na to is that the marginal benefit from providing or from consuming that internet service or having that internet service must be equal to the marginal cost of provision. Like in any other microeconomic model, marginal benefits must be equal to the marginal cost. And by implication, yun yung consequence nitong second equation. And by calculus, this is going to be equal if Y is greater than 0. Now, this means that to provide Y, to provide y, the sum of the marginal utilities of all consumers, lahat kayo na nasa bahay, yung marginal utility nyo, yung nakuha yung benefit from the internet must be equal to the total, yung sum ng benefits nyo must be equal to the marginal cost of producing a unit of y. Okay? That's the ideal. That's the ideal condition. However, y will not be provided in a competitive market. Right? It will not be provided in a competitive market as shown by the subsequent equation. So, suppose that y is sold in the market. Of course, this is absurd. Okay? Pero sige, let's consider this. Suppose that the internet service provider is sold in the market at price P. Okay, it's sold at price P. Now, each consumer will maximize his utility. Now, let's just change the notation para makonsider lang natin na X is for the individual consumer side. That would be the consumer side. So, he will each consumer. So, kada isang roommate, he will maximize his utility. Yung nasa okay, just to avoid confusion, yung nasa previous slide, this is your social optimal outcome. This is your Pareto optimal outcome. Marginal benefit, sum ng marginal benefits mo must be equal to the marginal cost. Ngayon, we are looking at how do we determine this marginal benefit, individual marginal benefit. So individual marginal benefit is drawn from this individual valuation. So, ito yung benefit ni person I. Okay? Tapos ito yung benefit, ito yung makokonsumo. Kumbaga ito yung nakokonsumo mong internet, ito yung nakokonsumo mong data. You can consider that as data consumption, no? Ito yung nakokonsumo mong data, ito yung nakokonsumo nung iba mong housemates. Tapos ito yung price of each amount of data that you're consuming. Okay, this should be XI, sorry. So the optimal condition is, of course, if you optimize this with respect to Xi alone, it's going to be the marginal utility, your own marginal utility must be at most equal to P star. Okay. By calculus, this by Kuhn-Tucker conditions, right? Based on classical programming that I just discussed last week, this will be equal if Xi star is greater than 0. Fine. Okay. So this condition will happen, or this condition happens for all housemates. So lahat ng housemates mo, ganyan yung magiging valuation. Okay? So all consumers, all housemates will maximize their respective utilities, yielding the equilibrium consumption. Xi star is equal to X star. Okay. So the total consumption satisfies this. Right? So pag in-add up ko to across all if I draw Xi star, across all housemates, right, and add them up together, this will yield the total consumption, and that total consumption X star will satisfy this condition with equality if X star is greater than 0. Dito lang din siya galing. Okay? So parang pinagsama ko lang to. If I add this, Xi star, as ito yung optimal condition for the rest of your apartment, for all of your other housemates, add this together, will yield this optimal condition. Okay? So ito yung sa utility side. Ito yung sa consumption side. Now, on the other hand, si internet service provider, he will choose this level of Y star for profit generation. He will choose this level of Y star that solves this problem. Okay? And of course, the optimal condition would be price must be equal to the marginal cost with equality if Y star is greater than 0. Okay. Now, if Y and X are non-zero, then your optimal condition will look like this. So yung marginal utility ng lahat ng households mo, lahat ng members mo, kada member ng household mo, will be equal to the marginal cost, right? And here we can obtain the competitive equilibrium X star equals Y star. Now, this time, let's define some parameter delta I that's equal to 1 if Xi star is greater than 0. And delta I equals 0 if xi star is 0. So indicator function lang, indicator parameter lang, that's gonna be equal to 1 if provision is positive, if the provision is non-zero, and 0 if xi star is equal to 0. Now, in a competitive market, in a competitive market, in a competitive equilibrium, x star is equal to y star. And from this condition, we already know that the marginal utility is positive. It's non-zero. Marginal utility is non-zero. Marginal cost is also non-zero. Right? Now, summing up the marginal utilities of all consumers, net of marginal cost. So if I add this marginal utilities across all housemates or all consumers, right? Let me just correct myself now. All individuals in the household will choose their optimal choice of X star, yung bandwidth, yung data allocation nila. So this total consumption, sabi nga natin kanina, you add this together, it will just yield this equation. Now, if I add the marginal utility, of all housemates, net of their marginal cost, you will get this equation. You will get this equation. Eh sabi natin kanina, well, the marginal benefit must be equal to the marginal cost, di ba? But we know that this is non-zero. This is always positive. In a competitive market, marginal utility is always not marginal utility is not equal to 0. Your marginal cost is not equal to 0. Therefore, this bracketed term is non-zero. Okay, this bracketed term is non-zero. Which means that, ano implication? If this 2 is non-zero, anong sabihin, anong mangyayari dito sa delta na to? Okay. What happens to this delta? This delta will be equal to 0 for some consumers. And therefore, there will be a suboptimal provision of public good. In any case, hindi mapoprovide yung public good in a competitive equilibrium. Alright? Kasi dito, saan ba galing itong bracketed term na to? This bracketed term comes from this. Okay? Siya galing. Dito siya galing. Okay. Now, if this is non-zero, if this bracketed term is non-zero, then it implies that this delta is 0. It implies that this term is 0. Okay. And this means that if delta is 0, it means that there will be under provision. Okay. There will be under provision. Okay. It also implies that fee, yung marginal utility mo would be greater than the marginal cost, which implies, well, if there is more than one consumer. So there will be consumers, again, there will be consumers where they will not provide anything. Now, for the rest of the consumers that well contributed, right, this fee of I, this marginal utility will be greater than the marginal cost, implying that competitive markets will yield suboptimal provision of public good. Why? Compared to the supposed optimal level. Yung optimal level natin must be this. Diba? It should satisfy this condition. Right? The Pareto optimal allocation should satisfy the maximization problem. However, if we allow production of a public good in a competitive market, this will happen. This will happen. Okay. So, yeah. There will be an underprovision. Kasi kung mas mataas yung marginal utility mo dito, kung mataas ang marginal utility mo, ibig sabihin, masyadong maliit yung Y. Okay? It means that Y is very small. Okay? And it implies that competitive markets will yield suboptimal provision. Now, of course, if there's only one consumer, right, that is if delta I is non-zero, it's equal to 1, okay, he will choose the optimal level of y. In other words, kung ikaw lang yung sige, let's put this equation in the better analogy. Kung ikaw lang yung may kinabang ng Wi-Fi, of course you will have to pay for the entire service. Okay? So therefore, your marginal utility will always be equal to the marginal cost. Kasi mag-isa ka lang eh. However, if there are, say, more of you in a single apartment who's considering setting up a Wi-Fi connection or modem in the house, some of the housemates may actually free ride. He will just say na, ay, hindi man ako magko-consume ng ano eh. Some of the housemates will say that I'm not gonna consume that Wi-Fi. Meron naman akong data. Pero once na nandun na, once na ma-provide na yung internet connection, of course, he will just free ride. And if everyone else does that, there will be an under-provision. The Wi-Fi the internet connection may not be provided at all. Kasi nga, everyone will just think na, okay, the rest, well, saan ba nanggagaling yung free riding issue dito? Dito siya nanggagaling. Okay, if you're thinking that everyone else will just choose the optimal level of XJ, edi gagawin ko na lang 0 tong sa akin. I'll not just consume. Kunwari, I'm not just gonna consume. Just let everyone else consume. And since if everyone else is gonna consume, they will pay. They will pay at the margin anyway. They will contribute to the marginal cost. It's gonna be this case if everyone else is gonna pay. Right? However, that's not the case in a that's not the case in a competitive market because everyone will just free ride. So the preceding analysis is a free rider problem. No? So you have private provision. Well, private provision is ineffective since one consumer can still enjoy it even if he doesn't pay, like what I mentioned earlier. Okay, so the solution would be you have a command mechanism. Right? So non-market allocation, socialism, you have non-market allocation. So you have an individual deciding whether to provide a good or not. That's a quick way to do things kasi nga lang, it may not be feasible for other goods. No? So non-market allocation. So government yung magde-decide, you state magde-decide. That's fine. You can also have voting. Wherein individuals will vote on the provision of the good. Okay. Now, if you're interested in public goods or public economics in general, the current program doesn't have any electives. Walang electives kasi for MAE on public economics. Okay? Dun kasi mas discuss yung public goods and externalities sa public sector economics. Yeah. But yeah, if you're interested, you can always read the text on Varian. Varian has a nice discussion of public goods. Okay? Nasa dulong chapter yun. In both versions of the text, both the advanced graduate and the undergraduate version. So you may want to consider that. Okay, so that finishes our section on externalities, market failures. So please answer your problem sets, your current problem set. The questions are pretty straightforward, and I think they're quite easy. So let me just remind you again to please work on your respective papers. And if you already have a working draft, isa pa lang yung nag-consult sa akin, please send me your draft so I can send comments, no? Kasi ilang weeks na lang tayo before the term ends. So please work on your term papers. As promised, wala naman ng final exam. You just have to work on that term long paper and prepare a presentation. No? Maybe you can have a Zoom meeting. Maybe we can discuss that over our discussion boards, right? And please utilize the discussion boards if you have questions. Okay, so that's all for today. Thank you very much.